Violence and civil unrest has broke out in the UK, and in this video we're going to be discussing how the UK got to this place and how also countries like Canada, Australia and New Zealand could be on the same trend towards rising civil unrest. A lot more pushback against high immigration. We're already seeing that in Canada. So fears of fresh violence put Britain on high alert. 6,000 specialist public order officers have been mobilized across the country amid fears that protests called for Wednesday night could lead to further riots. I just want to highlight right away, I don't condone looting, violence against police, people breaking the law. I don't condone any of that, and I think it's really wrong. I think a lot of the anger and frustration that is being took out on the wrong people. It's not the police officers, it's not business owners who are to blame for this. It is the government and the establishment. And the thing is, what often happens in this situation, and is also happening in this one, is you have two groups that are pitted against each other. And when you really think about it, it's about neither side, and it's really about the government, the power structures, but both sides kind of become obsessed with actually fighting each other or pushing back against each other, and they lose sight of what the whole protest was actually about in the first place. And obviously, when you have things like this happen, it also means it encourages out people of the extreme sides on both sides. I know a lot of the mainstream media has been saying these are far-right protests, and they've been saying that the other side has been relatively peaceful. And then when you actually look at the information, you've got a lot of young men on the counter protests wielding weapons, even a Sky News van that was attacked. You can see it, it's all over, and they've just been unable to hide it at this point. So there's obviously not very good reporting happening on this situation, and I'm sure there are also extremists on the protest side, so the anti-immigrant protests. But to actually label them as fascists, to group them all together and kind of pit these two sides against each other is very wrong, and that's exactly what the mainstream media is doing and continues to do. And we also saw the same thing obviously happen with the trucker protest and the way the mainstream media handled that. Thousands of police officers fanned out across Britain on Wednesday amid fears that protests planned by far-right groups would descend into fresh violence after days of anti-immigrant riots shocked the country. So once again, they are making the assumption here, and it's not just the New York Times, it's all the mainstream media organizations are making the assumption that they're far right just because they're anti-immigrant, which could not be the case at all. I mean, a lot of these people, from what I've seen, are just angry, frustrated. And, you know, it brings me back actually to the EU referendum vote, because I was in the UK and I remember how that went down and how they were predicting that we wouldn't leave the EU. And the reason why a lot of people voted to leave the EU was, one, they were concerned over immigration, and two, it was a pushback against the establishment. So that was a lot of it. So a lot of people, it was a protest vote. And then for a lot of people, it was also immigration. Obviously, the UK is a tiny country and they are taking in massive amounts of immigration, but so is Canada. And we're going to get onto that in a minute. So let me show you this chart, because you're going to think, boy, Luke, that looks exactly like the chart which we've seen in Canada. And it does. When you look at migration in Canada, it's absolutely exploding as well. When you go to Australia and look at migration, it's exactly the same thing. It went down and now it's absolutely exploding. And to a lesser extent, the same thing is happening in New Zealand as well. So you've got all these things happening, migration that has spiked, and basically, I don't think that it's solely the case that the reason for the economic stagnation and decline is solely to do with immigration. It's to do with the crony capitalism, the bailouts, all the things that happened in the financial crisis, because there was immigration before the financial crisis, as you can see, during the Blair era. And guess what? You didn't have the massive stagnation that you now have following the financial crisis. And I think a lot of that stagnation, obviously the cost of living crisis in the UK, they had a massive amount of consumer price inflation inflation, and the inflation rates were really off the charts on a personal level. If you just exclude the CPI and just think about it personally, the amount prices have gone up in the UK is absolutely insane, and people's wages haven't risen. So what happens is frustration builds, civil unrest becomes more and more likely, and you're just seeing that continue and continue and continue. And the same thing kind of happened with the BLM riots. You know, it wasn't just about Black Lives Matter for a lot of people. A lot of people were sucked into that because they were just so frustrated and they wanted some sort of channel to direct their frustration. So they went and looted, riots, and got involved in all these protests. What's happening right now in the UK is kind of crazy and scary, and it shows you what could potentially happen in years to come in Canada. Obviously, had BLM, then you had the trucker protests that happened in Canada, and the way that was handled was absolutely appalling. I mean, the government's response to that condemned by federal courts, yet we still have the same prime minister in charge when he should be behind bars, in my opinion. And when that happened, that was really the turning point for me in Canada, and I'm sure a lot of people as well, where you kind of realize that this country was a lost cause, because if we cannot unite together, push for change, and then basically the government declares war against you because you don't agree with their agenda. And in the UK, the mainstream media is very, very powerful and has a lot of control over the people, and it's very crazy to see what is happening in the UK. So you can see here, these charts, they're not far off. Obviously, you got it coming down during the pandemic when people weren't traveling, and you've got it exactly the same thing, exploding migration in Canada as well, and you see the same thing happening in Australia. So I think a lot of this immigration, what you're going to see happen is you're going to see civil unrest, you're going to see more pushback against immigration, and you're even seeing that with Canada. More and more pushback against immigration is happening. More and more people don't agree with the immigration, and you know, you've also got to think that we're doing a disservice to the immigrants. We don't have the jobs, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the housing, so those people essentially more likely to become homeless, more likely to be living in poverty, more likely to be using food banks. So by bringing them in, that does not mean good things for your country. And obviously, predominantly, these people that are coming to the country are mainly from India, China, and it's the same story in the UK. And the values of those places compared to Western values are very, very different. I mean, think of it this way, flip it around. Where do most people go from places like the UK and Canada to? Do they go to India? Do they go to China? No, of course they don't, because those values of those countries are very, very different. They're going to places in Europe. They're going to places like the United States. They're going to places like the UK. They're going from the UK to places like Canada. So that in itself tells a story. So when you bring a lot of people in and then you encourage them not to assimilate into society, what you have happen is you basically have segregated communities that are made exactly like Brampton, where it's not even like Canada in Brampton. It's like a totally different country when you go there. So Canada constantly says it's like a melting pot and it's multicultural, and the UK says that as well. But I can tell you from first-hand experience, both places are not like that at all. In Birmingham, for example, where a lot of the riots are happening, there are no-go zones, and there are places that I've been and you would not think you are in England. There's garbage absolutely everywhere, and you are just not welcome there. Like, if you walk down the street and you look like me, people are staring at you. You ain't welcome there, and it feels like a real hostile environment, because I had to actually go into places like that and work, and I did not feel welcome. I didn't feel safe there at all. And the police, they don't even go to places like that. They kind of exclude them from where they patrol because of all this PC nonsense now. Basically, the police are too scared to do anything. And I don't blame the police, because it's the policymakers and the government. So once again, I think all this anger, frustration directed at the wrong people here, the amount of violence and civil unrest going on in the UK is very, very disheartening. It's very, very sad that it's happening. but it's also a warning to other countries of what potentially lays ahead down the road if you continue on this path, because you cannot bring lots and lots of people into your country with the polar opposite cultural values, expect them to assimilate into society, which the government doesn't expect them. They know that they're just going to go into their segregated communities. But then guess what? When it goes to a certain extreme, people begin to push back because the country begins to lose its cultural identity. And that's exactly what England's going through. England and the UK is going through a identity crisis. Canada is another country at risk because it doesn't even have the history of the UK. The UK has a massive amount of history and culture. Canada is a relatively new country and it's already kind of diluted its culture down a lot. So when countries get into this phase and cycle of identity crisis, it's never a good thing. If you've read The Fourth Turning, you'll know that as well. So anyway, guys, if you've enjoyed this video, I would highly recommend that you check out this video here. And if you're looking for a VPN to protect your privacy, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. That's the affiliate link in the VPN that I use. And I will see you in the next one. Take